And I'm now welcoming Mike Hove from Fitchburg University. Mike, it's a great pleasure to see you again after all these years. Certainly have fond memories of working together in Leipzig. And we're looking forward to your presentation on Feel the Beat, music, bass, and movement. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
We still need to get Peter off the screen. And
mine's working beautifully. Mine's looking great on my side.
Yeah,
so I think it's
now, but we need an update on the YouTube.
Oh, no, that's just running behind. Don't worry,
Okay.
Sonia. It'll follow.
Okay.
You're good to go, Mike.
Okay.
Can you see my screen? Does it look okay? Just my one slide? No, you see my whole thing.
No, it's beautiful. You're ready to go.
Okay. So yeah, today I'll be talking about feeling the beat, music, bass, and movement. So I'm not talking about fish, the bass. I'm talking about bass, as in low frequency sounds. Really wonderful to see here. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. It's filling a void that I didn't really realize I was missing, having some intellectual stimulation, talking about biological bases of music. So today I'll be talking about something related to the theme of the conference, which one of the themes of the conference is musical universals, including perception action coupling, how we synchronize our movements with music. A closely related musical universal that I'll be talking about today is across the globe, there's some music that just makes people want to move along with it. So Peter Woest nicely set this up in the talk right before mine. So I think it's a really interesting idea. What is it about music that makes you want to move along with it? So it's interesting as a musician trying to figure out how to get people to move along with it. It's interesting as a scientist trying to understand the mechanisms and maybe telling us more about why music exists and what functions it serves. It's also interesting to try to harness it and develop it in an applied setting. So I'll be talking about a bunch of different studies that I've done over the last years. I've been studying motor timing and rhythm for a long time. One interesting finding that we keep observing in our studies over and over is that low frequency sounds, bass, has an especially close connection to movement and timing. This was kind of surprising at first, but now being that we've seen it so many times, I think it's a really clear link. I'll be talking about the mechanisms. We've explored mechanisms, including something about how low frequencies are encoded in the auditory system. You can also feel low frequencies more in your body. So I'll be talking about that as a potential mechanism. And then I'll conclude with some applications of using music with low frequencies to, for example, boost social connection. Right. So the first study I'm going to present today is actually the first paper I ever published. This dates back to before I started grad school. I was a drummer really interested in trying to figure out how musicians lay down this strongest groove or this aspect of music that makes people want to move along with it. One thing that I was really interested in is this idea that musicians play slightly apart from each other in time sometimes. So maybe the drummer will play a little bit behind the beat and the bass player will play a little bit on top of the beat. What that wide beat serves, what purpose that wide beat serves. I was living in Munich at the time, working as a research assistant. And back in those days, Peter Keller had a book checked out from the library. And back in those days, when you checked out a book from the library, physical book, you'd put a piece of paper in the stack and say that you checked it out. So I noticed, oh, Peter has this book I want. So I went and knocked on his door, and one thing led to another, and we ended up having a great long-term collaboration. We did this project together. I kind of mentioned this idea about this wide beat. We did a real stripped down version where instead of drums and bass and piano, we just had two tones. We had a low tone and a high tone. This is a tapping study, so we had people synchronize their finger tapping along with two-tone chords. In some blocks, a low tone came on early. Some blocks, a high tone came on earlier than the low tone. And one of the real interesting findings there was that movement timing was most determined by the low frequency. So people would tap with the low tone. I wonder if you can see my mouse, but I'll pretend pretend, imagine you'll see my mouse. So when people would tap along with these chords, they would tap along with the low tones. They tap earlier when the low tone came on first. They tap later when the low tone came on second. So this was we talked about some ideas why, but this was the first evidence that we saw of this. We were really interested in what's happening in the brain when people are listening to groovy songs. So this is along with Jan Stupacher, who gave a great talk yesterday. A bunch of these studies are actually with Jan. So Jan and Peter have been great collaborators and colleagues over the years. But we were looking at what was happening in the brain when people listened to high groove music. So we used transcranial magnetic stimulation, this figure-8 magnetic coil, and put it over their motor cortex and zap their brains when they were listening to high groove songs and low groove songs. And one big result was that the high groove songs modulated the motor system, even though they were sitting stationary. We had 4 high groove songs and 4 low groove songs, a pretty small sample of songs. They were matched on a bunch of factors like tempo and instrumentation. And so we just, out of curiosity, we put it through the music information retrieval toolbox and looked at what audio features might differ between the 4 high groove songs and the 4 low groove songs. And one thing that really clearly popped out was that the high groove songs had more bass, between 0 and 200 hertz. We did a follow-up study that was published a few years later with Peter Giannato. We replicated it in a larger sample of tracks. So we had 80 tracks. And again, the higher groove songs had more bass in them. We also, I should say, Jan composed some cool beats, and we manipulated the level of bass. So music with lower frequency bass, more bass, had higher groove ratings. I know it's ambiguous, but lower here means lower frequency bass, or more louder bass, actually. Those tracks that were recomposed had higher groove ratings. So this is, again, kind of further making clear that there's close connection between low frequencies and movement. I'll skip those music examples. The next study kind of continuing to establish this effect between the link between motor timing, or just timing in general, and low frequencies was an EEG study that I did with Laurel Trainer and Celine Marie at McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario. In that study, I was a postdoc in Laurel's lab, and she just published a paper showing that if you play a low tone and a high tone together, and you change the pitch of the high tone, you get a bigger mismatch response than if you change the pitch of the low tone. So this is kind of showing why people listen, why melody is often in the upper registers. So people are more cued in to pitch in the higher frequency ranges. We thought, oh, what if we did a similar study, but instead of changing the pitch of a high tone or low tone, we changed the timing of a high tone or low tone. So this is a little schematic where we had a low tone and a high tone. 10% of the time, the high tone would come on early. 10% of the time, the low tone would come on early. And those expectancy violations, that unexpected shift in timing, should create a mismatch negativity. Just the brain, it's an indication that the brain is surprised, basically. And we looked at the size of the mismatch response when you shift the timing of the low tone versus the high tone. So here's a little sample of what that sounds like. So those two-tone chords occasionally would have the low tone would come on, or the high tone would come on early. So that created a mismatch negativity like we expected. So about 150 milliseconds, there's an EEG plot, about 150 milliseconds after the onset of those shifted chords, you see a mismatch negativity. So you get a deflection in the ERP, and that's an indication of surprise, basically, an expectancy violation. If you compare the amplitude when you shift the high tone early, so you get the mismatch response if you shift the high tone early, but you get a much bigger response if you shift the low tone early. So that is, again, indicating that the brain is more cued in to low frequencies for providing timing cues. We followed up that result. That same paper, we did some modeling of the auditory periphery, looked how the spike trains were coming off the auditory nerve, and the modeling suggested that this effect, the mismatch negativity effect, was actually due to clear encoding of the low frequency stimuli. So I think this paper got some attention because it gets at the idea of why the musical convention exists to for low frequency instruments to lay down the pulse in music. So you think about what instruments are really driving the pulse or laying down the rhythm. It's usually the bass drum, boom, 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 or the electric bass or the upright bass, or the left hand and right hand piano. But that musical convention could be rooted in this auditory encoding of those low frequencies that leads it to provide stronger timing cues. So potential mechanisms between bass movement timing, encoding the auditory periphery. Nate Zuck had a really cool paper showing something similar. I'm just going to skip over this pretty quick, but I think it's good to put these references up so you can pause it if you're watching it on YouTube later. Silvino Zaradan and Tomasz Lankin, Peter Keller had some nice papers showing similar effects of enhanced response of low frequency tones, possibly due to attention allocation, possibly due to how it's encoded in the auditory periphery. Another factor to mention that's important for this link between low frequencies and timing and movement is the vestibular apparatus. So Neil Todd has a bunch of really great papers on the vestibular system, and I think that could be also a key factor. One thing to say though is a lot of our studies, the loudness is not high enough, it's not loud enough to actually generate a vestibular response. So that's part of the equation for sure, but not necessarily totally the main reason here. Speaking of loud, low frequency tones, I'll shift gears a little bit and talk, move from auditory encoding to body feel. So music perception is often thought of as a purely auditory experience, but it's clearly multi-sensory. If you see a musician playing, that changes your perception of it, but you can also feel the music in your body. So we're going to start exploring the feeling of music. So the vibrations from music. So if you put your hand in front of a speaker, that moving sound source is vibrating and pushing air molecules. You put your hand in front of a speaker, you can actually feel those air molecules moving via your mechanoreceptors on your skin. So low, loud sounds can be felt as vibrations on the skin. Touch has a peak sensitivity of about 250 hertz, so not super low frequency, but lower frequencies than that are often felt most for a couple of reasons. First of all, low frequencies are often played at a much higher sound pressure level. So sometimes the low frequencies are played at 10 to 30 decibels louder than mid or high range frequencies. This has to do with the Fletcher-Munson equal loudness curves. You have to play the low frequencies much louder at a higher intensity, higher sound pressure level for them to be perceived as equally loud. So it's EQ'd much differently, and low frequencies are boosted that way. You also have bodily resonances. So you have chest resonances at 50 to 80 hertz, for example, so you can feel it in your body. There have been some interesting studies showing that people can use tactile stimulation of music to discriminate timbre, pitch to some extent, musical meter, and people can synchronize their body movements with vibrotactile rhythms. We were interested in how feeling the music changes your perception of it, enjoyment of it, and your movement along with it. So where do you feel the bass most? Well, in the good old days, we used to go to concerts and clubs and you'd feel it there because they have big sound systems. For me now, it's in my car. So funny story, I actually came to Fitchburg State and we got this great new building, you get the great lab, but there were budget delays, so I didn't have a lab for my first year here. So I ended up having to run the study in my car. So I'd park the car behind Uris Hall and have the students meet me out there and say, okay, hop in the back seat. We're gonna do an experiment. So this was the setup here. The subject would sit in the front seat. I had a subwoofer surreptitiously placed in the back seat, and they had noise isolating earphones. They heard 10 different songs, 5 old clips, 5 new clips. They heard each song twice, once auditory only, and then another time auditory plus vibrotactile stimulation. So that's with the subwoofer in the back seat. Works great. You could definitely feel it in your guts and your back, that subwoofer playing. Stephen Martinez, who is a student who's working on the project, said to me, you know, all your Stevie Wonder and Meter songs, I mean, that's the music my grandparents listened to. So can I put some new songs in there? And I said, oh, sure, that's a good idea. So he picked out 5 new songs. And that's important, which I'll get to in a second. So that's the Parliament. This is a new song. Here's the bass drop. All right, so that's an example of an old and new song. So what we measured here, we asked about groove ratings. We asked about how much they enjoyed the music. We looked at spontaneous movement. So we had a video camera and we'd see how much change in pixel to pixel change there was. So we could actually measure the spontaneous body movement when they were listening to songs from video recordings, and we'd have them tap. We looked at the accuracy and strength of tapping. The vibrotactile stimulation, when they were listening to music over earphones plus that subwoofer, led to big increases in ratings on enjoyment and groove. So they enjoyed the songs more, they rated it as more groovy. They also tapped harder, but not more accurately. And they also had more spontaneous body movement when that auditory tactile stimulation was happening. The effects were especially pronounced for new songs, which I'll get to in a second, but the short version is that new songs have a lot more bass in them than old songs. There's EQ different. In a concern and rightful concern was that, oh, maybe the effects of auditory tactile are just due to being louder. So we were careful to try to block their ear canals, so it wasn't too much louder, but it's a valid question. So what we did in a follow-up study is we had people do basically the same experiment, but instead of being in a car, we had them wear a vibrating backpack. So 2 conditions, auditory only or auditory plus this vibrating backpack. So the low frequencies were delivered via this backpack. We also had a loud condition and a soft condition. No real difference between listening to it loud and soft in terms of groove rating, but there was a significant increase in groove ratings and enjoyment when listening to it over this vibrating backpack. So auditory tactile stimulation had higher groove ratings. All right. Next study I'm going to talk about was performed with Laurel Trainer and Dan Cameron at the Live Lab at McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario. They knew I was really interested in bass, so Dan and Laurel invited me up to collaborate on a study with them with some very special speakers. So they had these amazing VLF speakers, very low frequency speakers. This picture doesn't really do the speakers justice, but these are big enough to sit 4 people across, and they basically deliver ultra low frequencies, so between 8 and 30 hertz. So it turns out the subjects couldn't even hear it. You can definitely perceive it. You can feel it in your body rumbling, your chest shaking, but you can't actually, the subjects in the study couldn't hear it. So we did the good old days when we'd have be able to collect data in one go with a bunch of different subjects. In one session, we had a concert. So Live Lab in McMaster is this beautiful lab where you can, it's ecologically valid concert space where we fitted 100 people with motion capture crowns and had them attend this this techno concert by the band Orphix. And here's an example here. So this is what the music sounds like. I'm try to pause it there. You can see on this guy, I don't know if you, oh, maybe you can see it if I click over here. You can see he has a little bump on his head. That's actually the subject in front of the big light display. You can actually see he has a motion capture crown on. So what we did in that study is it was a real simple experimental design. It was a live concert. We would turn on the VLF speakers, the ultra low frequencies, every 2.5 minutes. So it'd be 2.5 minutes on, 2.5 minutes off, 2.5 minutes on, 2.5 minutes off. If you're looking at panel D, I don't know if you can see my my mouse or not, but panel D, you can see that. Panel A is the band, panel B is are all the people packed together, nervous about ventilation nowadays. Panel C is just showing that the VLF speakers had more energy between 8 and 30 hertz. We turn it off and on. The main thing we looked at was how much people moved. And in panel E, you'll see that people moved about 12% more when the VLF speakers were on, when that very low frequency was on. The amazing, so I'll say that again, the subjects moved 10% more or 12% more when the VLF speakers were on. The kind of amazing thing was that we did a follow-up study where people tried to detect when it was on, and they performed at chance. They could not consciously perceive when the VLF was on. So these results demonstrate that a complex social behavior dance can be driven by very low frequencies without the participant's awareness. So I think that's a pretty amazing result. Last portion of my talk, I'll briefly talk about some applications, how we can harness low frequencies for in a variety of settings. So the first one is just a commercial application. So Jan Stupacher and I and Peter Wust looked at the evolution of bass. So this was based on that previous study showing that the car study where the new songs had a lot more bass and the effects were stronger compared to the old songs. So the new songs were in the 2010s and the old songs were from the 70s and 80s. What we did in this study is we took the top 2 tracks in the Billboard music charts from 1955 to 2016, and we looked at a bunch of audio features using the MIR toolbox. And the clearest result was that we saw a huge increase in bass in music over those years. So the black dots are increases in bass between 0 and 50 hertz. And the gray dots are increases in bass between in 50 to 100 hertz. So you see this really clear increase in bass over the years. So of course, about the loudness wars where music has been becoming more compressed. So is it across all frequency bands? Well, no, it's really limited to these low frequencies. So you see the biggest slopes between 0 and 100 hertz, not that much of a difference, much smaller differences in the mid and high frequency ranges. So the reason why music becomes more compressed is because it offers some commercial advantage. That's the most common argument. But it seems like that loudness war is especially driven by bass wars and increases in bass over time. Another potential health application is to combat hearing loss. So as a professor here and becoming an old timer, I'm thinking when people walk into my classroom, you can hear their earbuds from 15 feet away, and I try to tell them about this, but I feel like an old man saying, "Oh, you're gonna lose your hearing in the next few years." And I actually in my classes, I have people do hearing tests in my sensation perception class. But a surprising number of these 18 to 22-year-olds are already experiencing hearing loss. One idea here is you could the question is, can you use tactile reinforcement to increase the perceived loudness? So does music sound louder when it's coupled with low frequency backpack vibrations? And does that in turn lead to a lower preferred loudness? Will people listen to music at a lower and safer level when they're listening to this, having this vibration? The last thing to talk about is prosocial applications. So Jan Stupacher mentioned this study of mine from 2009, that when you move together with somebody, you like them more. So this study has an interesting background as well. So it's been cited now over 1,000 times. It's a big number for a behavioral study. And it was written by me and Jane Reisman when we were grad students. And it was started as a Friday afternoon project. We thought, this is kind of an interesting idea. We can only work on it on Fridays. It's not really the main focus of our dissertations. And it wasn't very interesting to a lot of people at the beginning. I remember I asked Bruno Rep if, should I talk about this at your conference? He's like, I don't think you want to give a whole 15-minute talk on it. You should talk about it for a couple of minutes. People don't want to hear about how much people like each other, but it really has taken off, and it's been proven influential because it gives you an idea, gives some evidence for why people move along with music, because it has these prosocial applications. Jan talked about some nice research yesterday about how these effects are strengthened by music. They can be probably strengthened most by music that actually makes people move. One of my friends is a political scientist at UVA, Virginia, and he's anecdotally noticed that when people are coming together from different sides of the aisle to have debates and discussions, if you play some music before their interaction, it actually seems to be more productive discussion. So it'd be cool to formalize that. But there are, these prosocial applications, and how can we harness the strongest stimuli to get people moving along to increase prosocial applications. So to recap, and I'm running out of time, I hope I've convinced you now that there's a close relationship between bass, movement, and timing, probably rooted in how it's encoded in the auditory system and the vibrotactile system, and that there are some interesting applications to these problems. And I'd like to thank my great collaborators. If you want to have any questions or comments for me, here's my email, and you can find papers there. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mike, for this really super interesting presentation and some very intriguing final thoughts on political debates.
It's needed.
It's certainly something that I have thought about in terms of the emptiness of political statements. So maybe it's all about synchronizing thought. But anyhow, I don't want to forge ahead here. We have time for potentially one question, and I'm checking the channel right now. Questions for Mike?
There's a bit of a lag, obviously, so they haven't seen the end of your talk yet, Mike.
That's always the issue.
But I do have a quick question for you, Mike.
Okay,
do you want to collaborate?
Go ahead.
Do you want to collaborate? We're doing, because you were talking about applications, we are trying to make an app to get people moving. And we're looking at multisensory interactions. I also work on touch. So obviously your vibrotactile stuff seems pretty pertinent. So if you're interested, it's less of a question that requires anything more than a nod for now. But it's really,
that'd be awesome. Yeah.
It would be a nice way to.
Since we last published a paper together, so it's about time.
It's been a while. So that would certainly be something we can talk about maybe after the conference, or as we're still waiting. At the moment, you've just got lots of applause. You clearly were so clear.
Absolutely. People are going haywire, Mike.
Thank you.
But I'll use this opportunity just to say, if you do want to talk to Mike and ask him his questions in person, there is one question that's just popped up. I'll let Sonia ask you that first.
So let's do that. It comes from Asaf, super. Does synchronization to music have application on between groups, like decrease prejudice is the question.
I think so, but I have to look it up.
Okay.
I think it's a good question. And,
Okay. There's a commentary by Rochelle Ackley. I work on touch, and we should definitely look more into touch auditory interactions. You have given me a lot to think. So questions are popping in right now, Mike. You may want to go back to them and answer them. For now, thanks again for your very super cool presentation.